The warm water cascaded down Emma's skin as she leaned against the tiled wall, allowing the steam to envelop her. The house was quiet, her husband away on another business trip, leaving her to enjoy a peaceful evening alone. She closed her eyes, savouring the rare moment of solitude. A noise, faint yet distinct, pulled her from her trance. The creak of a door hinge, soft footsteps across the wooden floor. Her heart skipped a beat. The front door was locked, wasn't it? She listened closely, the steady hum of water drowning out the sounds beyond the bathroom. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps she was imagining things. Another sound, louder this time, a firm knock against the bathroom door. "Hello?" A deep voice called out, rough yet familiar. Emma's pulse quickened. She knew that voice. Mr. Harris, the neighbour. The man who had lived next door for years, always offering to fix things around the house, always greeting her with a polite smile. But what was he doing here? She reached for a towel, wrapping it hastily around herself before stepping cautiously toward the door. "Mr. Harris?" she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. A pause, then his voice again, softer this time. I didn't mean to startle you. Your door was open. I thought something might be wrong." Emma's fingers tightened on the towel, gripping the fabric as her mind raced. The door was open? That didn't make sense. She was sure she had locked it. "Are you all right?" he asked. She hesitated. Something about the way he spoke, the way he lingered behind that door, sent a strange thrill through her. This was wrong, wasn't it? But why wasn't she telling him to leave? Why wasn't she calling out for help? Slowly, she cracked the door open, just enough to see him. His dark eyes met hers, and for a brief second neither of them spoke. His gaze flickered downward, catching a glimpse of her bare shoulder where the towel had slipped slightly. Emma inhaled sharply, adjusting it, but the moment had already passed. The air between them felt thick, charged with something unspoken. "You shouldn't be here," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. His expression remained unreadable, his broad frame blocking the doorway. "I know," he admitted. Emma's heart pounded against her ribs. She should have stepped back, should have closed the door, but she didn't. Instead, she stood frozen, drawn into the intensity of his stare. A million thoughts ran through her mind, memories of the way he had always looked at her, moments she had dismissed as harmless. But now, in the dim glow of the bathroom light, there was no mistaking it. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. The boundary between them had already begun to blur. Emma woke up earlier than usual, her mind restless. She sat up in bed, rubbing her temples, trying to shake away the thoughts from the night before. The way Mr. Harris had looked at her, the way the air had shifted between them. It was wrong. She knew it. And yet it lingered in her mind like a whisper she couldn't silence. Stepping into the kitchen, she went about making coffee, hoping that the routine would steady her. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, casting golden streaks on the countertops. As she reached for a mug, her eyes wandered toward the backyard, where the neighbouring house stood. Mr. Harris was outside, mowing his lawn, his broad figure moving steadily across the grass. Her breath hitched. He wasn't wearing a shirt, his dark skin gleaming with sweat under the heat of the sun. His movements were slow, deliberate, his muscles flexing with every push of the mower. Emma's grip tightened around the mug. This was ridiculous. She shouldn't be staring. She shouldn't even be thinking about him. But her body betrayed her logic, a warmth creeping through her veins. Just as she was about to look away, Mr. Harris turned his head. Their eyes met. A slow smirk tugged at the corner of his lips, as if he knew exactly what she had been thinking. Emma's stomach flipped. She swallowed hard,
forcing herself to break the eye contact and turn away, but her pulse remained erratic. This had to stop. She busied herself with cleaning, scrubbing the counters harder than necessary, trying to drown out the thoughts that refused to leave her alone. She was married. She loved her husband. What had happened last night, whatever that moment was, meant nothing. It was just a fluke, a mistake. But later that afternoon, a knock at the door sent her stomach plummeting. She knew who it was before she even opened it. Mr. Harris stood there, leaning slightly against the door frame, an easy confidence in the way he held himself. "I think I left my phone here yesterday," he said, his deep voice smooth, eyes searching hers. Emma hesitated, her fingers curled around the edge of the door. "Your phone?" He nodded. "Yeah, I had it when I stopped by. Must have slipped out of my pocket." She wasn't sure if he was telling the truth, but she stepped aside anyway.
Allowing him in, the space between them felt too small, the walls closing in as he walked past her. As he pretended to search, she could feel his presence, an unspoken tension settling in the air. When he finally turned to her, holding nothing in his hands, he let out a small chuckle. "Guess I must have misplaced it somewhere else." Emma's pulse quickened. "You should go," she murmured, her voice not as firm as she wanted it to be. He stepped closer, his eyes locked onto hers. "You sure about that?" His voice was low, sending a shiver down her spine. Her body screamed at her to step back, to put distance between them, but she didn't move. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling as rain lashed against the windows. Emma stood in the dim glow of candlelight, arms crossed, trying to shake the unease creeping through her. The power had gone out an hour ago, and despite trying to call her husband multiple times, there had been no answer. She told herself it was just bad weather, that he was probably caught up in work, but a strange nervousness lingered. A sharp knock at the door made her jump. Her breath hitched as she hesitated, heart pounding against her ribs. She already knew who it was. Slowly, she opened the door, revealing Mr. Harris, standing there with a flashlight in hand. His presence felt larger than usual, the flickering candlelight casting shadows over his face. His voice was calm, deep, reassuring. "Saw your lights were out. Figured you might need some company." Emma swallowed. She should have said no, should have thanked him and closed the door, but instead she stepped aside, allowing him in. He walked past her, shaking rain from his jacket, the scent of damp fabric and aftershave filling the small space between them. She turned toward the kitchen, desperate for something to do with her hands. "I was just making tea. Would you like some?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sure," he said, settling onto the couch as if he belonged there. The silence between them stretched, heavy with everything left unsaid. Emma focused on pouring the tea, ignoring the way her fingers trembled. When she turned back, he was watching her, his eyes dark, unreadable. "Must be nice," he murmured, breaking the silence. She frowned. "What?" "Having someone to call when the lights go out," he said, setting his flashlight on the table. "Someone to come home to." Emma hesitated, his words catching her off guard. She sat down across from him, clutching her tea, unsure how to respond. "You don't have that?" she asked, already knowing the answer. He gave a small, tired smile. "Not anymore." For the first time, she noticed something beneath his usual confidence, a loneliness, something deeper than she expected. The storm outside roared, thunder rattling the windows, but inside, the world felt quiet. "You must miss her," she said softly. His fingers tapped against the rim of his cup. "Some nights, more than others." Emma looked down, guilt twisting inside her. She wasn't sure why. Maybe because she had been thinking of him too much. Maybe because she had allowed herself to feel things she shouldn't. A sudden crack of thunder made her jump, her hands tightening around the cup. Mr. Harris reached forward instinctively, his hand covering hers. The touch was brief, but it lingered. Emma should have pulled away. She didn't. Neither of them spoke, their hands still touching. The storm outside grew louder, but inside everything stood still. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting golden light over the backyard. Emma stood by the flower bed, absent-mindedly spraying water over the plants, but her mind was far from gardening. She could feel his eyes on her. Across the yard, Mr. Harris stood on his porch, leaning against the railing, watching her. His presence was undeniable, heavy, inescapable. She had told herself to stop this, to put space between them, but something about him pulled her back in every time. She glanced up, meeting his gaze. Neither of them looked away. A slow, knowing smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. He took a sip from a glass in his hand, deliberate, unhurried, like he had all the time in the world. Emma's fingers tightened around the hose. Her phone buzzed on the patio table. She grabbed it, reading the message from her husband. Work ran late. Home after midnight. Love you. She exhaled sharply, her heart beating a little too fast. An entire evening alone. When she looked back up, Mr. Harris was already walking toward her. Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't move, didn't stop him. He reached the fence, resting a hand on the wooden post. His voice was low, intimate. You know this is dangerous. Emma nodded, but she didn't step back. A charged silence settled between them. The scent of fresh grass and something unspoken filled the space between their bodies. Mr. Harris leaned in just slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. You want me to leave? Emma parted her lips, but no. Words came out. He lifted a hand, his fingers grazing her wrist, tracing slowly up her arm. Her skin burned where he touched. Her chest rose and fell in uneven breaths. She could have stopped this. She didn't. Instead, she turned, walking toward the back door, leaving it open behind her. Footsteps followed. The door clicked shut. The space inside felt smaller, the walls pressing in as Mr. Harris moved closer. His fingertips skimmed her shoulder, pushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear. You tell me when to stop. Emma's lips parted, but the words wouldn't come. His hand slid lower, resting at her waist, pulling her closer, just enough for her to feel his warmth. Her body made the decision before her mind could catch up. She kissed him first, a slow, hesitant surrender at first. Then all hesitation melted away. Hands roamed, breaths mingled. The air turned thick, electric, a quiet gasp, a whispered name. Everything blurred into heat, sensation, urgency. By the time it was over, the weight of what she had done settled in. Emma lay still, staring at the ceiling, her skin still tingling from his touch. The guilt came like a wave, but so did the thrill. The morning sun streamed through the blinds, casting thin golden lines across the sheets. Emma stirred, the warmth of the room pressing against her skin. A dull ache rested in her chest, heavy and undeniable. Her mind replayed everything, the way his hands had felt, the whispered words, the heat that had consumed her so easily. She turned onto her side, curling into herself, as if it would somehow erase the night before. Her body still tingled in places she couldn't ignore, but alongside that was something darker. Guilt. A deep, gnawing guilt that made her stomach twist. A buzzing sound from the nightstand cut through her thoughts. She reached for her phone with trembling fingers, a message from her husband. Good morning, beautiful. I miss you. Hope you slept well. I'll be home soon. Her throat tightened. She blinked, staring at the words, willing herself to feel something other than this tangled mess of emotions. She typed a quick reply, forcing normalcy into her words. Miss you too. Can't wait to see you. The lie sat heavy on her tongue. A soft knock on the door sent a jolt through her. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Then his voice, steady, unreadable. Morning, Emma. Her pulse quickened. She sat up, clutching the sheets to her chest, her body immediately betraying her by responding to the sound of him. She shouldn't answer. She should tell him to go. But she didn't. She hesitated for only a moment before rising, her legs unsteady as she reached for her robe. She cracked the door open just enough to see him standing there, his expression calm. But his eyes held something else. A knowing look, a quiet challenge. Can I come in? His voice was smooth, low, dangerous. Emma swallowed. Number, you should go. A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. Are you sure about that? She hated how easily his words made her knees weak. Last night, she started, but the words failed her. He stepped closer, his hand brushing her wrist, igniting that familiar spark. I know you, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. You don't regret it as much as you want to. Her body betrayed her, the way she shivered under his touch, the way her breath hitched. He was right. Her mind screamed for her to shut the door, to put space between them, to fix the mistake before it unraveled further. But when his fingers traced along her arm, when his lips barely brushed her temple, she let her eyes flutter shut. Your husband's coming home soon, he reminded her. She nodded. She knew. So why wasn't she stopping him? She parted her lips to say something, anything, but instead her grip on the doorknob loosened. She let him in. And deep down, she already knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The late afternoon air was thick with heat, pressing against Emma's skin as she sat in her car outside the grocery store. Her phone buzzed on the seat beside her, but she already knew who it was. Mr. Harris. Again. She closed her eyes, her fingers tightening around the steering wheel. How had it come to this? A few weeks ago, she had been a devoted wife, a woman content with her life. Now, she was a woman sneaking glances at her phone, her heart pounding at every unexpected knock at the door. The screen lit up with another message. I need to see you. Emma's pulse quickened. Her body still burned from the last time they had been together. But alongside the pleasure now sat something darker. The mistakes were piling up. Just yesterday, she had nearly forgotten to delete a text. A simple, careless message. I can't stop thinking about you. She had caught it just in time, her heart slamming against her ribs as she quickly swiped to erase it. But the near miss left her shaken. And then there was the scarf, a silky, expensive thing he had left behind in her bedroom. She had tucked it into the back of her drawer, far from her husband's eyes, but the thought of it lying there felt like a ticking time bomb. Her mind drifted to the neighbour, Mrs. Calloway. The old woman always seemed to be watching, her sharp gaze following Emma whenever she stepped outside. That morning, while Emma had been watering the garden, Mrs. Calloway had appeared at the fence, a knowing smile curling on her lips. "Late night, dear?" Emma had forced a laugh, pretending not to understand. "Saw someone leaving your house around midnight. That your husband?" Her breath had caught in her throat. She had seen him. Emma had played it off, laughing it away, but the unease had settled deep in her bones. Now, as she stared at her phone, another message popped up. "Don't ignore me." Her hands trembled as she reached for it, typing quickly. "I can't do this today." The response was immediate. "You wanted this, and you still do." Emma let out a shaky breath. He was right. That was the worst part. The guilt, the fear. It was there, clawing at her, but so was the hunger. The way he made her feel was intoxicating, addictive. And she knew, no matter how much she tried to convince herself otherwise, that she would go back to him. She would keep making mistakes, and sooner or later, one of them would be the one that ruined everything. The front door creaked open, and Emma's stomach twisted at the familiar sound of her husband's footsteps. He was home earlier than expected. She wiped her damp palms against her jeans, forcing herself to look normal, to act as if nothing was wrong. The air inside the house suddenly felt too thick, too warm, and she could already feel his eyes scanning the space around them. "Hey," he called out, setting his keys on the counter. "What's for dinner?" Emma swallowed hard, her throat dry. I was just about to start cooking," her voice came out shaky. Did he notice? She turned toward the stove, desperate to find something, anything to busy herself with. But before she could move, he spoke again. "What's this?" She froze. Slowly, she turned to find him holding the shirt, not his shirt, not even close. Her chest tightened. She had been so careful, she thought she had hidden everything. Yet there it was, evidence in his hands. He turned it over, his brows furrowed. "This isn't mine." Emma forced a laugh, too high-pitched, too unnatural. "Oh, it must be from the laundry mix-up." He didn't answer right away. His jaw clenched, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The weight of the silence between them was suffocating. Then his next words sliced through her like a blade. "Mrs. Calloway said she saw someone leaving the house last night." Her pulse roared in her ears. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the counter to steady herself. She must be mistaken. His eyes, sharp and unforgiving, locked onto hers. "Emma, don't do that. Don't lie to me." Her lips parted, but no words came. The truth sat between them, hanging in the air like a storm about to break. She saw it in his face, the pain, the anger, the betrayal. "How long?" he asked, his voice quieter now, but more dangerous. Tears burned in her eyes. He took a step back, shaking his head. Disgust, heartbreak. She could see it all written in his expression. Then, as if the moment couldn't sink any lower, her phone buzzed on the counter. Both of them looked at it. The name flashing on the screen made her stomach drop. Mr. Harris. Her husband let out a breath, a bitter, humorless chuckle. Unbelievable. The room spun. Emma reached for him, desperate, her voice cracking. "Please, just listen." He took another step back. "I don't think I can." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "I love you." His eyes darkened. "Number if you did, this wouldn't have happened." A long silence stretched between them. Then he grabbed his keys. Emma's heart stopped. "Where are you going?" His voice was hollow, a man who had just lost everything. "I don't know." The door slammed behind him, and just like that, he was gone.